Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm Joan Miller, and this is just a brief presentation of some good sources of COVID information. We're going to send the slides, including the web links, to everybody, so you don't have to worry about the information. I'll go through each of the information source first, and then I summarise the current state in Sheffield at the end. So next slide. Yeah, here's my list of reliable information, and I do actually really recommend the City Council COVID page. It's got up-to-date detail on daily cases, and it's got access to maps on the small areas, which seem to get updated every day as well. You can get alerts by email, and oh, hold on. Sorry. Greg Fell's videos are very good. The Independent Sage, of course, which is broadcast on Friday. And actually the Star newspaper COVID page is pretty good. And they often get to the stories before the council. And there is a parliamentary library which gives restrictions by area. So we'll go to a screenshot of the Sheffield COVID page, which is the next slide. So it's on the right-hand side of the COVID page, and you can see it's, well, Monday it's updated every day at 4 o'clock. So on Monday there were 415 cases. There were 629 on Sunday actually, and you can see the rapid rise in cases that we've got in Sheffield there. Okay, let me think. Yep. On Friday there were only 148. So this is, well, you can see the rapidly rising trend. Okay, slide 4. So you get a map of the whole of England, but then you can focus in on Sheffield. And this data, you can see it's only up to the 1st of October, and it's a week, but they do update it every day. So it'll be the 2nd of October tonight. So you can go into the small areas, and last week Sheffield didn't have any of these dark areas which indicate heavy numbers of cases. And what you've got over in the west of Sheffield, you've got Ranmore with 251, Broome Hall with 118, Broome Hill with 37, Highfield, Devonshire Quarter, Sharrow and Burngreave also kind of affected with these hotspots. And none of them were there last week. So Sheffield didn't have hotspots last week, started with Ranmore on Friday. Okay, next slide. So Greg does some really clear and useful videos, usually about 6 minutes. This one's the 28th of September, and he's saying it's hotting up. And more recently, the Star's saying that, well, the Star is reporting him as saying they're getting a lot more cases, but it hasn't translated into admissions yet. And probably Sheffield will be getting more restrictions similar to the rest of the north of England. And he does give insights into local admissions and local deaths, which I can't find anywhere else. Okay, the Independent Sage. It's broadcast every Friday, but you can watch it on YouTube. And I really recommend the first 15 minutes. They pull together all the national data and give really good insights. So what Christina Pagel said this time was that COVID cases have been rising throughout September, particularly in the north. She talked about the overrepresentation of BAME people in admissions and people on ventilators. She talked about the 20-80 rule, where 20% of people cause 80% of cases, the kind of super spreading. but the main message was test and trace is the way out of this situation. And that currently the contact tracing services are failing more in the hotspots. So positive cases referred are down, and the number of contacts actually reached are down, particularly in the hotspots. So you can see that's not good. Okay, final slide, I think. Just a little summary. Sheffield's an area of concern. We're on the second rung of the watch list. We'll get enhanced support because of that. The STAR reported 500 students and staff from the university are positive. Yeah, my opinion is that if the trend continues, we'll join other parts of the north and have greater restrictions imposed. And the STAR reports that Greg Fell says more or less the same thing, and he thinks by the end of October, but possibly sooner. Okay, and all the links are on the next slide and they can come to you. Okay, thanks.
Lovely, thank you very much, Joan. That's really useful and helpful to have a clear outline of where we are at the moment and of good sources to go to if we want information, how to keep ourselves up to date.
Mike, you're breaking up. We can't hear you.
How to ready, and Ian is getting the story on at the moment. Bing.
Are we going Fran next?
Lovely.
Hello.
Yeah. 2 seconds.
Not sure what's happening here.
We're going over. I think it's Fran next, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right.
I think you're on, Fran.
Right. I've not got my first slide on mine. Do I need to do anything?
I think if you ask Ian, he'll have it for you in a second or two. He's
Right.
wonderful.
I'll wait for Ian to put the first slide, but yeah. Okay.
Maybe if you have an introduction, that would help just to fill some space while he's getting it ready for us.
Yeah, okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Fran Pitt, or Fran Betteridge, my married name. Oh, something's happening. And I was a Director of Health Protection in East Midlands. I'm only going to give you 6 slides very briefly and probably tell you things that you already know. But I'm a firm believer in with infections, know your enemy and how it spreads, and think back to basics, really. Okay, next slide, please, Ian. Right, so I mean, the first thing we think about is the incubation period, and the incubation period for coronavirus is most commonly 5 days, and that's certainly what Donald Trump found after he attended a super spreading event in the Rose Garden. So he's as common as the rest of them. The incubation periods can last up to 14 days, but it's usually 3 to 11 days, and that gets 97% of people who go on to get the disease. The pre-symptomatic phase, and we think about, and that's one of the features of this disease, is transmission in the from asymptomatic people and people who are developing their symptoms, and that's 48 hours for people that are in the pre-symptomatic phase is one of the periods when they're most infectious. As people go on with their disease, it reduces as symptoms progress. So and then when symptoms stop, they like to allow 48 hours after symptoms stop. So that determines the quarantine period for people who have had the disease. They say up to 10 days, but and 48 hours after symptoms have stopped. So again, you know, Donald Trump's symptoms haven't stopped, but it doesn't stop him sort of carrying on spreading it. So next slide, please, Ian. Right. Asymptomatic people, I mean, this is a real issue, and there's a lot of research looking at the kinds of, you know, are they tend to be younger people or what? And there's nothing definite yet, but there's certainly studies going on about it. It can, in some studies, they're saying it can be up to 40% of those who are infected. And they also say if you're asymptomatic, pre-symptomatic, or in early stages with symptoms, your virus shedding can be just as infectious. The only thing about people who are asymptomatic is that they are less likely to shed through coughing and sneezing. The cons of asymptomatic people is that they're more likely to be out and about and therefore shedding the virus. So next slide, please, Ian. Right, there's a lot about in the literature now, and there was a recent article in the Lancet saying that airborne transmission is the major route of transmission. And there was a lot of worry at the beginning of the pandemic about surfaces. And although that's still valid, and washing your hands, the vast majority of infections are got either by inhaling droplets or, more worryingly, inhaling aerosols. And basically aerosols are much smaller droplets. And as we talk, we cough, we sneeze, we blow trumpets, we're spreading those from our lungs, from our upper respiratory tract into the air. And a lot of the controls are around how do we stop people getting infected through droplet infections. And in general, for the sake of argument, they say droplets are greater than 5 microns. And when people exhale them, they generally fall to the ground within a few seconds and within 2 meters. And as I said, they're created by normal exhaling, talking, coughing, sneezing, and breathing. Aerosols are small droplets that are less than 5 microns. And inconveniently for policymakers is that they remain suspended in the air for much longer and can drift. And then they build up in concentration, usually in poorly ventilated, confined spaces. And aerosols are created in the same way as droplets are. You know, as we exhale, there's a variation in size of particles. But there's also been a worry about aerosol generating procedures such as dentistry and even flushing toilets. You know, talking about if you flush a toilet, flush it with the lid down, so you don't create aerosols in the environment, because that's. But I mean, this is the big worry about transmission in poorly ventilated and confined spaces. Next slide, please, Ian. Right, epidemiologists tend to think in terms of person, place, and time, and risk is a compound of these factors. So when you look at, you know, the person and the risk of transmission, you want to know the amount of virus that they're likely to be exhaling. And as I've said before, they're more likely to be most infectious just before they get the infection and in the early stages of symptoms. although they can carry on being infectious until the symptoms go. And there is quite a lot of nuanced research going on about, you know, how long the virus is exhaled by symptomatic people. You want to know the distance apart. You know, the magic number 2 meters is not absolute, but you know, it's a measure. Want to know, you know, what activity they were doing. Were they talking? Were they having to shout? Were they singing in a choir? Or, you know, I can remember in the early stages of the pandemic, they had a brass band playing socially distanced in our churchyard, and I gave them a bloody wide berth. Even though they was, you know, people were standing around listening to all this. And then was the person wearing a mask, and what type of mask? And, you know, my pet hate is these visors, because all they do is stop droplets falling in your eyes as far as I can see. Then the place that people are in, you know, indoors, outdoors is so crucial, I think. And ventilation, there's loads of research, particularly in engineering and architect magazine, sort of not magazines, articles about ventilation in learned magazines, and about how they can modify the indoor environment. They're starting to look at things like UVC light to kill viruses. But I'm a simple person, and I think it's around, you know, opening the windows and trying to get it diluted. And then length of time, because in general, when you talk to the general public, the ideas of risk can vary, and people obviously have different perceptions of risk. But I think getting overexposure time is crucial. It's a different ballgame passing somebody in the supermarket aisle compared to, you know, how long they sit next to somebody in a meeting or a concert or in the Rose Garden at the White House. So next slide, please. These, whoops. Right. These COVID activity risk indicators, that there's loads on the internet, and this is an example, basically showing common risks and how you sort of can grade them. And obviously, you know, if you take things like going to a restaurant, I mean, I'd want to know what you know, was it a big restaurant? You know, what's the ventilation? You know, are they able to open the windows? Do they keep the doors open? You know, what's it like? You know, is there a long corridor to get to the loo, and is the loo sort of a confined space, and how crowded it is? So, you know, it's these are very broad brush, these activity risk index, but they are a guide. So that's all I want to say at the moment, except to tell you about an old medical officer of health, the one advice he gave me about respiratory infections in nursing homes and care homes. He said, when you go in, get them to open the windows, get the fresh air in. And that's, you know, I think that's, you know, as good advice as any. That's me. Thanks.
Okay, so is it me next, Ian? I can't hear Mike.
It's you next. I'm just going to find your slides.
So look, I'll just start rambling a bit. So I'm Bing Jones. I'm a doctor and one of the founders of this little troupe. So we've heard a little bit about where we can find information and a bit of background. And I'm just going to talk about what we in Sheffield are going to do about it, because we're in a difficult situation. Just to preempt my slides before they arrive, bottom line is that test and trace is not working terribly well. We all know all this. We need to get out of lockdown. I still can't see my slides. Oh, here we go. Fine, great, okay. So we in Sheffield have had a good history before. We've actually done something. We did a pilot study a few months back, and we're going to do another study, hopefully starting tomorrow. Okay, this is called Finding COVID-19 Using Self-Referral, Symptoms and Risk Factors. Okay, next slide, please, Ian. Okay, so why are we doing this? NHS test and trace has problems. There aren't enough tests. They're not targeted enough. There are delays, and that basically the whole system is not working. Incidence is rising, and winter is coming along. Independent Sage thinks that we're actually only able to isolate about 18% of the contacts of infected people. I think it's much less than that. So we're designing a little study here to see if we can show that being local, volunteer and zero cost, we can use people's symptoms, their story. So we can do the first bit of diagnosis, which is to talk to people, use their symptoms and their exposure risk and get in there straight away. So as soon as we talk to somebody, we can act, as opposed to test and trace, which takes ages to get a test, report it, and then move on from there. So we're hoping to see if we can find cases and contacts days earlier, address the shortage of tests, and address the fact that a lot of people are just not going to want to get a test. They either don't want to or they can't. So hopefully at the end of this exercise, we'll produce a report saying a certain number of cases, we managed to self-isolate them, but test and trace wouldn't. We got to cases that were self-isolating, had a test, but never heard back. We're going to find cases and contacts days earlier, we hope. Okay, so we've got the general drift. We want to come up with a broad brush sort of journalistic finding to say that we could find people that test and trace aren't finding and get to them quicker. Ian, next slide, please. So how are we going to do it? We're going to send out an invitation either to people, for people to refer themselves, and we're going to try and involve GPs in this as well, but the GPs won't refer, they'll just be signposting people to us. We'll direct folks to our website where there's a page and it takes them to a little form, and that goes to a special inbox, and the inbox will direct us to allocate that patient to a volunteer, that case. And the volunteer will give a number, get in touch with them, go through our standard script and advise all about isolation and why we're doing this, find out about what their symptoms are. I'll cover the symptoms in a minute. And they'll either accept or reject that person and record lots of data. Okay, so yeah, there are certain limitations on this. We don't want to get in touch with anybody that's already in touch with NHS Test and Trace. Our main aim here is to find the difference between getting in touch with symptoms and waiting for a test. Next slide, please, Ian. So the invitation is pretty simple, and I won't go through it here, but it's basically saying we're a volunteer group. We're going to talk to you about your symptoms. You must still get in touch with NHS Test and Trace. So we're not an alternative. We're making sure people do go through all the standard channels, but then we're going to compare the results. So we'll isolate you and your case several days earlier, we hope. So please get in touch with us. Next slide, please. So we need everybody's help. So either we could do a big press release and possibly be inundated, or we can ask you guys, anybody who's involved with us, to help disseminate this through email and WhatsApp groups, Facebook pages, or whatever. So we'll be sending out to everybody that we can, probably tomorrow or fairly soon, saying, please, could you get this message out? And it'll have the text of that invitation I just sent out and the link to the email. If we don't get very far, we might have to do a big press release, in which case we then might have to cope with a lot more than we can cope with, because we've got a limited manpower. Okay, then we hope to get a report out fairly quickly and then write a more detailed report later. This is a small exercise. Our first pilot, we just did 10 cases and 60 of their contacts. This one we're going to go for a bit bigger, maybe 20 cases. And so it might be maybe 100 contacts. We may even not be able to cope with that, but we're going to see how we go. Next slide, please. How are we going to work it? We're going to work it on symptoms and risk factors. So the standard 3, we're going to expand to 5 symptoms. So that's loss of taste and smell, severe breathlessness, fever, tiredness, and a cough. But then we're also going to include another feature, which is increased risk, such as being close contact to a known case. You know, my partner has got COVID. Employment, public-facing roles, healthcare, teaching, factories, parties, that sort of thing. Basically, the slide that Fran just showed previously. So we're going to accept a combination, which is any 3 of those features above, the loss of taste and smell plus 1 other, or increased risk plus 2 others. And we'll accept or reject people from that. Okay, next slide, please. So there are potential problems with this. It's not easy to explain that we're doing this because the government is not doing too well, but we're not stopping you from going through the government process. So you are going to have to do it twice. But the bottom line is that if the initial case gets a negative test, we will then stand down all the contacts. Some people will think we're a scam or be unwilling to give their personal details. So there are potential problems here, but we'll just see how we go. But the bottom line is that the government is not doing well. They're not focusing in on the people that they need to do. They're getting loads of test results from people that really are not a big risk, and they're doing it nationally and not locally. So we've got some really good messages here. Which if we can make this little pilot thing work, this study work, it will be great. I think that's the last slide, isn't it, Ian? So
it is.
Yep, so I've finished there. So I think I've just about covered my 6 minutes. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Lovely. So it'd be really lovely to have questions while Ian and Tom are organised for us to go into some small groups, and there we've got some scenarios that have already been sent to you, but I can also post the wording of the scenarios in the chat for you, but you'll may need to copy that as we go into small groups.
Mike, how many groups do you want me to set up?
There are, I would have thought 3 groups would probably be a good idea, because that gives us a good mix of people who've been in the steering group and people who've been doing it for longer and people who've had less experience. So if we can try and mix up those sorts of aspects, that would be really wonderful. You're muted, Ian, so I didn't hear you swearing about my impossible demands there.
I'll do my best. See you in a minute.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. So to give Ian some time, Tom has a first question to start.
Yeah, a couple of questions. I think one for Joan and one for Fran, really. With Joan, could you explain a bit more about the 80-20 rule that you talked about? And for Fran, I just wondered about, at the moment, I live part of the time on a building site, and some of the guys here are vaping, and you can see their vapor just going blooming everywhere. It's much, much, much more than 2 meters. I mean, they really get going on that. And I just wondered if that is an indication of aerosols or droplets or what the hell's going on. So 80-20 from Joan, please.
Okay. Yeah, 80-20 is a common rule somehow in many things, but it was brought up in the Independent Sage, and it's part of this just that coronavirus behaves differently from the flu, and it seems to spread in jumps. So, and it's this, and sometimes people call it the super spreader. events. So they've estimated that 20% of people who are positive cause 80% of the onward cases. And so most people don't cause any other onward case, in fact. So it's just starting to understand that more clearly. And some of it relates to what Fran said about the indoor events, the prolonged time indoors. Does that make sense?
How does that affect the R number then?
Okay, I think what they're starting to say is that the R number doesn't tell you everything, and you need to take into account something called K. So that's a whole other
breakfast.
That's a whole that's a whole other conversation, but it's about coronavirus being different. And I think some of the Asian countries understand that super spreader thing better than we do, because we've organized around flu, and flu does a kind of, you know, steady state, and the coronavirus does, you know, okay, we've got 5,000 people from one person who was positive. Can happen. That has happened. Yeah.
Right. In terms of
Okay.
vaping, I mean, I don't know what size the particles that come out of people who vape, but I mean, it is basic physics, and the, you know, they have shown that there are viable viruses in quite small aerosols. I suspect, you know, the droplets will contain more virus, and a lot of the early, you know, as Joan was saying, in the early stage they were thinking flu, and they were thinking it behaves like flu, and so, you know, you see that you can see the droplets coming out of people's mouths, and then they sort of fall to the ground, and that's why they've said 2 meters. And flu tends not to be viable in aerosols, whereas this virus is. And inconveniently, you know, the aerosols can stay in the air for quite some time. They can drift, they can blow around, and they can also build up in concentration, which is why it's so good to be in the outdoors if possible, because, you know, there's massive dilution. So, I mean, I don't know what to say, whether vaping actually, you know, somebody with coronavirus is vaping. Is that, I don't know. Don't know if they'd be spreading it, possibly, yeah, by aerosols. But I don't think vaping would increase that spread particularly.
Lovely, that's really helpful. I'm aware John has a question, and then Rosemary has also put her hand up for a question, and then Carrie as well.
Hi everyone. Is that unmuted? Yeah. Right, I think it's probably for being. So I've been a bit out of the loop here, and I'm not sure if this is a relevant question, but I've seen figures that say perhaps the percentage of tests that turn out to be positive, I've seen 0.25%, 0.5%. In other words, the vast majority of tests are negative. Now, that means with the proposed setup, you're going to be contacting a huge number of people who will then be, once the test is back and is negative, they'll be told it's all okay, false alarm. Now, that's one aspect, and the other aspect is, are we still following up the thing which was very much a theme of the first pilot, which was very inaccurate, and sometimes it's more accurate to go with symptoms. So I'm a bit confused about where we're at there.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. It's a really good question. The reason why there are so many negative tests at the moment is that the people who are tested are relatively unselected. Well, they're completely unselected. So the whole concept of diagnosis, the traditional diagnosis, is you go to the doctor, you tell your story, doctor examines and then does a test. So the doctor has a load of information before they even request the test. Our government, bless them, have decided to bypass all of that traditional stuff and just go for the test and allow people to self-select. So what we're doing is we're using some evidence, and there's the Zoe app from King's, which has been collecting data on people's symptoms and then finding out who's had a test and relating the two. And they've come up with all sorts of probabilities of individual tests and clusters of tests. And we estimate that probably with this little selection, we've got no evidence, we're just going to begin collecting some evidence, that both looking forwards and looking back, we've heard this business of looking back is important. So if you asked all the people that went for a test today, have you had any risk factor for acquiring coronavirus? The vast majority of people would not have any risk factor. So we're hopefully bringing that in as well. So we are hoping that my general gut feeling is that we may be about 50% of the people who we identify maybe turn out to be positive. But even the test, you see, has many false negatives. So if you have 100 people who are genuinely infected and you test them all, and then you test them all again and possibly again, you find that the first lot of tests, the single test, misses a lot of people. So these are false negative tests, and that's probably around 30%. So we may not be as good as the test, but we're not bad. And what's the point of doing a test if you only isolate the contacts 10 days later when they've already done all the viral spreading? Whereas we would be identifying possibly fewer people, but straight away. So that's our rationale. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so people that you've selected as to take on, then you will stick with them and their contacts regardless of their test result. Is that right?
Good question. We have made a pragmatic decision to say we won't do that because it is conflicting with the government advice. Right. So we've said that we will stick with the government advice, but we will hopefully give a little bit of a speech, such as the one I've given, and we will offer them one further thing, which is, would you mind us phoning you up or texting you in a week's time to see whether you did get some symptoms? Because in our last study, we did find people who then did develop symptoms. And there are lots of cases of people. We've also had people from the first study who then had an antibody test, which showed that even though their swab test during this pilot was negative, they did develop antibodies. So they in fact have had the infection. Okay, so yeah, does that cover it?
That tells me that the people, the focal terms, you stick with them, you keep them, yeah. You've told me what happens to the people with symptoms. I'm not clear what happens to their contacts. So once you've got a negative test, what do you do about the contacts? You've got to get back to them because, well, you are getting back to them each day anyway. So what do you do there?
If the original case, the index case, comes back with a negative test, we'd get in touch with all of their contacts, standing them down, saying, no need to worry, stop self-isolating. Your case, your initial case has turned out to be negative, but there is a chance that you may still get a virus. So go on and do your work because that's what the government says. But if you do get ill, can we ring you in a week, or could you get in touch with us and we'll just note it? And just say also, we would say, if you do develop any symptoms, then, that get a test, get back into the system. Okay, hope that's clear.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
And moving on to Rosemary.
Hiya, sorry I was late. I wanted to pick up something that Francis said about the spreading and this comment about passing in the supermarket and what kind of risk that is considered to be. You didn't actually specify it, but as I understand it, the government advice is that you're at risk if you spend 15 minutes in close contact with someone who has the illness. So passing in a supermarket presumably is pretty low risk.
Yes, it is low risk. What I was trying to get over is the gradation of risk. You know, there's no cut-off points, which I think.
Oh, so the extremes.
The extremes, yeah. I was just
Okay.
looking at extremes, really.
Thank you.
And I think basically also it's a judgment call, really. You know, yeah. Okay.
Lovely. I'm going to take a last question because Carrie had her hand up to ask a question a while ago. If there are other questions, it'd be really great if they went in the chat box. We'll try and then type some answers back on those during the small group time. So at any time, add things, and whoever can in the small groups will make sure that we try and get answers. But last question from Carrie, and then we're going to go into small groups. I hope you can access, if you haven't already got access to the scenarios, I put a link to a Google document to try and help do that. So if my attention wandered at some point earlier, it was because I was making sure there was a Google link for you all to download if you hadn't got it. Carrie, you're about to ask a question, I hope.
Yes, I just wanted to know, I mean, the situation has moved on obviously since April and May, in that the government from the end of September is actually now going to give money to people on low income who are having to self-isolate, who aren't eligible for sick pay. But how does that kind of figure, because that's half the reason, is it not, that people haven't been self-isolating because they can't afford to. Now, if the kind of payment that is now going to be paid to people, if they have to self-isolate, that obviously is only going to be triggered by an official test. So what we're doing, if, you know, it's not official, is it? So they haven't been officially diagnosed, so they won't be eligible for that money. So that's going to make them feel, what, you know, if they're in, you know, low income, you know, it's going to be back to that same old problem that they can't afford to do it, and then they don't do it, and that's the danger. Thanks.
Shall I answer that?
That'd be lovely, Bing, because I didn't want to.
Good. Good point, Carrie. But basically, we'd only be asking them to self-isolate for the few days until the test result comes through. But it is a very good point. We would have to explain that to people, but it hopefully would only be a few days. But I'm afraid what actually will happen is that a lot of people, it was even much longer. So a lot of people are only being told to self-isolate 10 days after the original test. So, you know, what do you do? But it's a good point. We'd have to explain that, but hopefully we'd say it's only for a few days. Hope that answers your question.
I guess the only other thing that could be done is to try and put pressure on Parliament to make sure that it's done in relation to notification as well as test results. And that would allow GPs to be doing a confirmation on symptoms. But that's another way forward and another challenge. Shall we move into small groups and look at the scenarios? And then we're going to come back and have about 15 minutes at the end to think about the lessons we've learned and the challenges that are raised by the scenarios. I guess the aim of the scenarios is to help us think and look at real challenges and the sort of problems we might have and how we can resolve them, and to learn together. So we're going to be in 3 different groups, and Ian